Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring a murder so shocking, so carefully staged, and so utterly without resolution that it has haunted Los Angeles for nearly 8 decades. A young woman, a vacant lot, a mystery that over 150 suspects could not solve. Here's what happened. January 15, 1947. A Tuesday morning in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. Betty Bersinger is walking with her young daughter through a residential area near Norton Avenue when she notices something in the weedy lot beside the sidewalk. At first, she thinks it might be a discarded store mannequin. The figure lying in the grass is pale, impossibly still, and positioned with a precision that doesn't look accidental. Then she gets closer, and she understands, with a horror that would stay with her for the rest of her life, that what she is looking at is not a mannequin at all. She grabs her daughter, walks as quickly as she can to the nearest home, and calls the police. The responding officers from the Los Angeles Police Department would later describe the scene as unlike anything they had ever encountered in their careers. The victim was a young woman, positioned with deliberate, methodical care. Her body had been divided at the waist. She had been completely drained of blood. Her skin had been meticulously cleaned. And she had been placed in the lot with her arms raised above her head and her legs straight, as though arranged by someone who wanted her to be found exactly like this. Investigators would spend weeks, then months, then years trying to answer one central question. Who was she, and who did this to her? The answer to the first question came relatively quickly. Within a day of the discovery, the Los Angeles Examiner, using then cutting-edge fingerprint identification technology through a wire transmission to the FBI in Washington, D.C., was able to confirm her identity. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. She had been born on July 29, 1924, in Boston, Massachusetts. And the answer to the second question, who was responsible for her death, has never been found. Not in 1947. Not in 1957. Not in 1997. And not today. This is the story of Elizabeth Short, the woman the press called the Black Dahlia, Hollywood's most gruesome cold case, and one of the most investigated, most debated, and most haunting unsolved murders in American history. Before we go any further into the investigation and the suspects, it is worth pausing to understand who Elizabeth Short actually was. Because in the decades since her death, her identity has been buried under layers of tabloid mythology, Hollywood dramatization, and speculation. The woman behind the nickname was a real person, with a real life, and she deserves to be understood as such. Elizabeth Short was born in Boston, Massachusetts, on July 29, 1924. She was one of 5 daughters born to Cleo Short and Phoebe May Sawyer. Her early childhood in Massachusetts was marked by hardship. In the late 1920s, her father, Cleo Short, disappeared after abandoning his car near the Charles River in a way that initially led family members to believe he had died by suicide. He had not. He had simply left. Phoebe Short raised her 5 daughters largely on her own through some of the most economically brutal years in American history, the years of the Great Depression. Elizabeth was known in her family as a girl with a bright, outgoing personality, though she suffered from chronic respiratory problems that made the harsh New England winters difficult. As a teenager, she began spending winters in Florida, where the warmer climate agreed with her health. She worked small jobs, spent time socializing, and by the early 1940s, she had discovered that her father was, in fact, still alive and living in Vallejo, California. In 1942, she traveled to California to reconnect with him. The reunion did not go well. She and her father had a falling out relatively quickly, and Elizabeth struck out on her own, drifting to Camp Cook, a military installation in Santa Barbara County, California. She was later arrested at Camp Cook as a minor found in a bar. She was just 18 at the time, and was returned to Massachusetts under the supervision of a probation officer. But California had made an impression on her, and she returned to the West Coast again in subsequent years. By 1946, she was living in and around Los Angeles. She is frequently described in post-mortem press accounts as an aspiring actress. However, it should be noted that she had no known acting credits and no documented employment in the entertainment industry. She was a young woman living in a city full of young women who had come to California with dreams, doing what so many of them did, working small jobs, socializing, meeting people, trying to figure out what life would hold. She was known to be sociable, charming, and attractive. She was 5 feet 5 inches tall, with dark hair, green eyes, and a slender build. She moved between acquaintances, staying with friends and contacts, and in the weeks before her death, She appears to have been moving between several different locations in the Los Angeles area. The last confirmed sightings of Elizabeth Short alive come from January 1947. She had been staying at the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, and there are accounts placing her at various locations in the days before her body was discovered. According to records and reporting from the period, the last widely documented sighting of her alive occurred in the days immediately preceding January 14 or 15, 1947. After that point, there is a gap, a period of time during which she vanished from the world of the living and entered the world of history. Now let's talk about the morning of January 15, 1947, in more detail. Because the circumstances in which Elizabeth Short's body was found are central to understanding just how extraordinary this case is. Leimert Park in 1947 was a residential neighborhood in southwestern Los Angeles. The area near Norton Avenue, between 39th Street and Coliseum Street, contained vacant lots in those years, open stretches of weedy ground sitting between homes and streets. When Betty Bersinger made her discovery that Tuesday morning, she was walking along a path that local residents used regularly. The vacant lot itself was significant for a reason that investigators noticed immediately. There was no blood at the scene. None. Given the nature of the injuries Elizabeth Short had sustained, the complete absence of blood at the location where her body was found meant only one thing. She had been killed elsewhere, her body prepared elsewhere, and then transported to this lot and arranged deliberately. Whoever left her there had carried her to that spot, either by vehicle or on foot, and had taken care to place her in a specific orientation. The positioning was too deliberate, too precise, to have been accidental. The killer, or killers, had staged the scene. And that staging told investigators something important. This was a person who was not panicking, not rushing. This was someone who was, in some deeply disturbing way, in control. The LAPD assigned multiple investigators to the case almost immediately. The investigation would eventually involve detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department's Homicide Division, and it generated one of the most voluminous case files in LAPD history up to that point. Contemporary newspaper accounts, including those from the Los Angeles Times and the Los Angeles Examiner, covered the investigation in extraordinary detail, sometimes in ways that would later complicate the investigation itself. Photographs of Elizabeth Short's face, pulled from identification records and personal photographs provided by acquaintances, ran on the front pages of Los Angeles newspapers within 48 hours of her body being found. The press coverage was immediate, intense, and in many respects, unprecedented. Los Angeles in 1947 was a city that was rapidly becoming the center of American popular culture. Hollywood was at the height of its golden age. The city was booming with post-war optimism. And then, into the middle of all that bright California sunshine, came this. The newspapers needed a name for her. Not her real name. Her real name was Elizabeth Short, but a headline name, a name that would sell papers and lodge in the public imagination. The name they chose was the Black Dahlia. The exact origin of that nickname has been debated for decades. The most widely accepted explanation, referenced in multiple historical accounts of the case, is that the name was inspired by a 1946 film noir called The Blue Dahlia, which had been a major box office success just months before Elizabeth Short's death. The blue became black, likely reflecting the darkness of the circumstances, and the name stuck with a permanence that Elizabeth Short herself never knew. It is worth saying clearly, because it matters. Elizabeth Short was not called the Black Dahlia in life. She was Elizabeth Short. The nickname was given to her after her death, by a press that was more interested in a compelling headline than in the dignity of a 22-year-old woman from Boston. Historians have noted that the Black Dahlia case was one of the first major crimes in post-war America to capture truly national attention. The combination of the location, glamorous, sunlit Los Angeles, the victim's age and appearance, and the genuinely shocking circumstances of the crime created a story that traveled across the country through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and word of mouth. It was, in a very real sense, the beginning of the era of the nationally famous cold case. And that national attention would bring consequences, some helpful and some deeply counterproductive to the investigation. Now let's turn to the investigation itself, the detectives, the evidence, the leads, and the suspects. Because if this case teaches us anything, it is that more attention and more information are not always the same thing as more clarity. The LAPD's investigation into the murder of Elizabeth Short began on the day her body was discovered and expanded rapidly in the days that followed. Detectives canvassed the Leimert Park neighborhood, interviewing residents and attempting to determine when the body had been placed in the lot. Based on the accounts of neighbors who had walked past the area the previous evening and seen nothing, investigators concluded that the body had likely been placed there in the early morning hours of January 15, before dawn. Forensic examination of the body was conducted by the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. The official determination placed the time of death at approximately January 14 or 15, 1947. The examination also revealed that Elizabeth Short had been held for a period of time before her death, likely more than a day, based on the state of her remains and evidence of certain injuries that appeared to have been inflicted over a period of time rather than all at once. This was significant. It meant that somewhere in Los Angeles, or perhaps nearby, there was a location where Elizabeth Short had been held against her will. A location that was private enough and isolated enough that whatever happened there went undetected. Investigators were not just looking for a killer, they were looking for a place. And they never definitively found either. Here is a question I want you to think about as we move through the investigation. If you were a detective assigned to this case in January 1947, with the information we have just described, a body transported from an unknown location, placed with deliberate precision, and no witnesses to the actual crime, where would you start? Think about that, because it helps illustrate just how extraordinary the challenge facing the LAPD actually was. Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, we go through every comment, and we love hearing your thinking on these cases. The investigation moved quickly on one front, identifying who Elizabeth Short knew, where she had been in the weeks before her death, and who might have had reason to harm her. Detectives interviewed dozens of people who had known her, or who claimed to have known her, in Los Angeles. They traced her movements through acquaintances, hotel records, and the accounts of people who had seen her in the days leading up to her disappearance. What they found was a picture of a young woman living a somewhat transient life in a sprawling, fast-moving city. She moved frequently between different accommodations, relied on the hospitality of friends and acquaintances, and had a wide circle of social contacts that was difficult to fully map. She had been in a relationship with a man named Gordon Fickling, a military pilot, and she had also been associated with another man named Joseph Gordon Fickling. It should be noted that accounts in the historical records sometimes use slightly varied names for acquaintances from this period, as many records came from press accounts rather than official court filings. She had at various points been in contact with an Italian man named Robert "Red" Manley, a married salesman who was among the last confirmed individuals to have seen her alive. Manley told investigators that he had met Elizabeth Short in San Diego in early January 1947, and that he had driven her to Los Angeles, dropping her off at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9, 1947. Manley was investigated extensively. He was administered a polygraph examination, which he reportedly passed, and investigators ultimately moved away from him as a primary focus of their investigation. He was never charged with any crime in connection with Elizabeth Short's death. The Biltmore Hotel sighting was significant because it appears to be among the last times Elizabeth Short was definitively placed in a known location before her death. Multiple hotel employees reportedly recalled seeing a woman matching her description at the hotel on the evening of January 9. After that, the trail goes quiet. Where she went after the Biltmore, who she met, and where she spent the days between January 9 and her death on or around January 14 or 15, these questions have never been conclusively answered. It is a gap of roughly 5 days. 5 days during which Elizabeth Short's life came to its terrible end, in circumstances that remain unknown. The investigation generated something that was, even by the standards of major homicide cases, quite remarkable. Confessions. Lots of them. In the weeks and months following the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body, the LAPD received dozens of confessions from individuals claiming to be responsible for her death. Contemporary press accounts and historical records document that the number of false confessions ran into the dozens. This phenomenon, the flood of false confessions following a high-profile, sensationally covered crime, is one that criminologists and psychologists have studied extensively in the decades since. People come forward for all manner of reasons, some seeking attention, some genuinely mentally unwell, some apparently moved by a compulsion that is difficult to fully explain. In the case of Elizabeth Short, every confession had to be investigated, every claim had to be verified or disproven, and every lead had to be run down. This consumed enormous investigative resources and, in many cases, pulled detectives away from leads that might have been more productive. The Los Angeles Examiner took an unusual step in the days following the discovery. The newspaper received a package in late January 1947, shortly after the body was found, that purported to be sent by the killer. The package contained several items, including what appeared to be personal belongings of Elizabeth Short's, among them her birth certificate, her address book, and several photographs. A note accompanying the package was assembled from cut-out newspaper letters in the style that would become familiar in later decades from other high-profile cases. The LAPD and the examiner treated the package as potentially genuine communication from the killer. Investigators hoped that the address book, in particular, would yield names of individuals who might have been known to Elizabeth Short and who might be connected to her death. The address book reportedly contained numerous names, and all of them were investigated. The package and the note it contained have been the subject of debate ever since. Were they genuinely sent by the killer? Were they sent by someone with knowledge of the crime? Or were they a hoax? The LAPD was never able to definitively establish the origin of the package, and no charges were ever filed in connection with it. What the package did do, unquestionably, was deepen the public's fascination with the case. The image of a killer bold enough to mail evidence to a newspaper, to taunt investigators through the press, added a layer of menace to an already terrifying story. And in 1947 Los Angeles, with newspapers being the dominant mass medium, the story of the Black Dahlia became something close to a citywide obsession. Over the course of the investigation, the LAPD identified and investigated more than 150 persons of interest. 150. Let that number settle for a moment. In a single homicide investigation, over 150 individuals were examined as potential suspects. Detectives interviewed, investigated backgrounds, verified alibis, and in many cases conducted extensive surveillance and follow-up on each of these individuals. The range of persons of interest over the decades has included individuals from virtually every walk of life: service industry workers, veterans, medical professionals, individuals with prior criminal records, people who knew Elizabeth Short personally, and people who had no known connection to her at all but came to the attention of investigators for other reasons. Not one of them was ever charged. Not one was ever brought to trial. The case never moved beyond the investigation stage. It is important to be precise about this, because the LAPD never charged anyone, and because all identified persons of interest were ultimately released without prosecution, every one of those individuals is, under the law, presumed innocent. In a case this old, with this many names attached to it, the presumption of innocence is not merely a legal formality, it is an ethical obligation. We will not be naming specific living individuals in this video as suspects, because no one has ever been charged or convicted, and because several theories about this case have attached names to real people who deserve the protection of that presumption. What we will do is discuss the broad categories of investigative focus and the types of evidence that guided detectives over the decades. One major investigative focus in 1947 was the question of medical knowledge. Multiple forensic pathologists and medical examiners who reviewed the evidence determined that whoever was responsible for the preparation of Elizabeth Short's body appeared to have possessed some level of anatomical knowledge or surgical skill. The precision with which certain procedures had been carried out was inconsistent with what investigators might expect from an individual with no medical or anatomical background. This led the LAPD to examine, among its many leads, individuals with medical training or surgical experience. This category of investigation was pursued extensively but never led to a charge. Another investigative thread involved the geography of the case. The fact that Elizabeth Short's body had been transported to and placed in the Leimert Park lot suggested that whoever was responsible had access to a vehicle and had likely moved through Los Angeles in the early morning hours of January 15 without being observed. Investigators tried to reconstruct the likely route a vehicle would have taken from an unknown point of origin to Norton Avenue, and interviewed potential witnesses along possible routes. This effort produced no definitive results. The investigation also turned to Elizabeth Short's social circle and the relationships she had formed in her time in Los Angeles and in her prior travels. She had been associated with a number of men, some of whom had military backgrounds given the wartime and post-war context of her life. The world Elizabeth Short moved in was the world of late 1940s Los Angeles, a city flooded with returning veterans, a city of bars and diners and movie theaters and rooming houses, a city where strangers became acquaintances quickly and where a young woman without a stable home base might find herself in a wide variety of company. Several individuals from this social world were examined by investigators. All were ultimately released without charge. Now, here is something that genuinely challenges what many people assume they know about this case. The Black Dahlia murder is often discussed as though it was primarily a mystery of identification, as though, if investigators had only known who Elizabeth Short was, or had only found one key witness, the case would have been solved. But the truth is more complex and, in some ways, more troubling. The LAPD in 1947 was not a small, under-resourced department. Los Angeles was one of the largest cities in the United States, with a police department that had significant experience with serious violent crime. The investigation was not, by the standards of the era, a neglected or perfunctory one. The opposite, in fact. The case received extraordinary resources and extraordinary attention. Dozens of detectives worked the leads. More than 150 individuals were investigated. The FBI was brought in. The fingerprint identification of the victim was accomplished within roughly 24 hours through a direct wire transmission to the FBI's central records, which was itself a demonstration of sophisticated law enforcement capability for 1947. And yet, nothing. The case went cold not because it was ignored, but because the evidence was not sufficient to bring a case to court. Or because the key evidence, the location where Elizabeth Short was held before her death, the vehicle used to transport her, the individuals who may have had direct knowledge, was never found. Or because the person responsible was simply very careful, and very lucky, and lived in a city large enough and mobile enough to disappear into. This is the frustrating truth at the heart of many cold cases. It is not always that investigators failed. Sometimes, the person who committed the crime simply did not make the mistakes that lead to arrests. The case never fully left the public consciousness, and in the decades following 1947, it was periodically revived by new investigations, new claims, and new theories. The LAPD's case file on the murder of Elizabeth Short remained open, and periodically, detectives would return to the evidence with fresh eyes and sometimes with new forensic tools that simply hadn't existed at the time of the original investigation. The second half of the 20th century saw the Black Dahlia case become something of a cultural institution. Books were written, some serious historical analyses, some sensationalist accounts, and some that mixed the two. Filmmakers returned to the story repeatedly. Journalists periodically published new investigations. True crime writers, amateur investigators, and researchers devoted enormous energy to the case, advancing theories, challenging existing assumptions, and in several cases claiming to have identified the killer with certainty. None of these private investigations produced a charge or a conviction. The LAPD has consistently maintained that its investigation into Elizabeth Short's death remains open. Let's look at the broader investigative landscape of theories that have been advanced over the decades, because understanding the range of ideas that serious researchers have proposed helps illustrate just how genuinely uncertain this case remains. One category of theory focuses on the organized crime and criminal underworld connections in Los Angeles during the late 1940s. Los Angeles in 1947 was a city with a significant underworld presence. Gambling, prostitution, and corruption were endemic to parts of city life, and the LAPD itself was at that time a department with well-documented corruption problems that would eventually lead to major reforms in subsequent decades. Some researchers have argued that Elizabeth Short may have come into contact with individuals connected to criminal networks, and that her death may have been connected to that world. There is no documented evidence in the public record that definitively establishes such a connection, but the theory has persisted. Another category of theory focuses on a single individual perpetrator acting alone, driven by psychological compulsion. The staging of the body, the apparent deliberation of the crime, and the apparent medical knowledge involved have led some criminologists and researchers to argue that Elizabeth Short's killer fit the profile of what we would today call a serial offender. Someone who had killed before and would kill again, or who had at least planned and prepared for this crime with care and specificity. This theory is compelling in some respects but has never been connected to a specific provable individual. A third category of theory involves the possibility that the crime was connected to Elizabeth Short's personal relationships, that someone who knew her, who had some kind of intimate or emotional connection to her, was responsible. The fact that her body had been cleaned and transported, rather than left at the scene of the crime, could be read as evidence that the killer was attempting to conceal evidence of his own connection to her. It could also be read as evidence of deliberate staging. Both interpretations are consistent with the physical evidence. What makes this case so uniquely difficult, and so uniquely compelling to investigators and researchers over the decades, is that none of these theories can be ruled out. The physical evidence that survives from 1947 is limited. Forensic science in 1947 was a fraction of what it is today. DNA profiling, which has solved countless cold cases in the modern era, did not exist. The ability to extract and analyze trace evidence from crime scenes was far less sophisticated than it is today. and many of the physical items recovered from the original investigation have, over the course of 80 years, been lost, degraded, or simply are no longer available for modern analysis. The passage of time, which can sometimes bring new witnesses and new information to the surface, has in this case more often worked in the other direction. The individuals who knew Elizabeth Short personally, who moved in her world in 1947 Los Angeles, who might have had the kind of first-hand knowledge that could crack the case, most of them are now gone. The generation that lived through those years has largely passed. And so the Black Dahlia case sits, as it has sat for decades, in that particular kind of historical limbo that the most famous cold cases occupy, too well known to be forgotten, too evidence-poor to be solved. It is worth spending a moment on the role of the press in this case, because it is unusual and important. The Los Angeles newspapers of 1947, primarily the Los Angeles Times, the Los Angeles Examiner, and the Los Angeles Herald Express, covered the Black Dahlia case with an intensity that would be difficult to overstate. Front-page stories ran daily in the immediate aftermath of the discovery. Reporters competed aggressively for any scrap of new information. The Los Angeles Examiner in particular played an unusual role. The newspaper was part of the Hearst newspaper chain, and it pursued the story with the kind of sensationalist energy that William Randolph Hearst's papers were known for. The Examiner was the paper that received the package purportedly sent by the killer, as noted earlier. It was also the Examiner that used the Black Dahlia nickname prominently, helping to cement it in the public vocabulary. But the press coverage was a double-edged sword for the investigation. On one hand, the extensive coverage brought public attention and witnesses forward. Some of those witnesses provided genuinely useful information. On the other hand, the detailed reporting on the specifics of the case contaminated the investigative pool, because potential witnesses and potential suspects alike now knew what the LAPD knew, or thought they knew. It also fueled the wave of false confessions, as the sensational publicity gave the case an almost mythic quality that drew disturbed individuals forward. Historians of American media have pointed to the Black Dahlia case as an early example of the tension between press freedom and the integrity of criminal investigations, a tension that would become increasingly familiar in subsequent decades as television and later the internet transformed the pace and volume of crime reporting. Let's talk about what we know about the days immediately preceding Elizabeth Short's death. Because this is the period that investigators focused on most intensively, and it is the period where the trail is most frustratingly incomplete. Based on historical records and press accounts from 1947, the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short at a specific named location was at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles on the evening of January 9, 1947. Robert Manley, the married salesman who had driven her from San Diego, had dropped her at the Biltmore. Hotel staff reportedly saw a woman matching her description in the lobby that evening. After January 9, Elizabeth Short's movements are not definitively documented. Her body was discovered on January 15. The medical examiner estimated her time of death at approximately January 14 or 15. There is, therefore, a period of approximately 5 days during which she was alive but her whereabouts are unknown. Investigators in 1947 worked to fill in this gap. They received tips, conducted interviews, and followed up on possible sightings. Some witnesses reported seeing a woman they believed to be Elizabeth Short at various locations in Los Angeles during this period. None of those sightings was definitively confirmed. The gap remains. What was happening in those 5 days? Where was Elizabeth Short? Was she staying with someone she knew? Had she met someone new? Was she already in the hands of the person who would kill her? Or was she, for part of that period, simply going about her life, unaware of what was coming? We do not know, and not knowing is perhaps the hardest part of all. Because at the end of all the theories, all the investigations, all the books and films and documentaries, what we are left with is a 22-year-old woman from Boston who came to California and never went home. Who was given a nickname she never knew and a notoriety she never wanted. Who deserved better than what she received from the world in her short life, and who deserved better from history than to be remembered primarily as a macabre symbol. Let me now turn to some of the specific investigative threads that have received the most serious scholarly and journalistic attention over the decades, because understanding these helps explain why the case has remained so stubbornly unresolved despite so much effort. The medical knowledge question has been central to many of the most serious analyses of this case. When the LAPD brought in forensic pathologists to examine the physical evidence in 1947, the consensus was that whoever was responsible had a working knowledge of human anatomy that went beyond what an ordinary layperson would possess. This finding has been repeated and generally affirmed in subsequent analyses by medical and forensic experts who have reviewed the historical record. This is significant for two reasons. First, it narrows the theoretical suspect pool in a meaningful way. Surgical knowledge or anatomical training was not something that every person in Los Angeles in 1947 possessed. Second, it raises a question that investigators pursued extensively. Were there individuals with medical training in Elizabeth Short's social orbit, or in the orbit of people who knew her? The LAPD investigated medical professionals as part of its broader sweep of persons of interest. This included physicians, surgeons, medical students, and individuals with military medical training, a category that was particularly relevant in post-war Los Angeles, given the large number of veterans who had received medical training during the war and who were now returning to civilian life. None of these investigations produced a charge. But the medical knowledge element has remained a consistent feature of serious analysis of the case, and it has guided multiple private investigations over the decades. Another significant thread is the question of the crime's location. As we established earlier, Elizabeth Short was killed and held somewhere other than the vacant lot where she was found. The person responsible transported her body across Los Angeles in the early morning hours of January 15, 1947. Investigators tried for years to identify the primary crime scene, the location where she was held and killed. This effort was never successful in the official investigation. Over the decades, various private researchers have proposed different locations as the possible primary crime scene, based on their own analysis of the geography, the transportation logistics, and circumstantial evidence. Some of these proposals have been elaborate and detailed. None has been definitively confirmed. The inability to find the primary crime scene is one of the most significant gaps in this case. Had investigators in 1947 been able to identify where Elizabeth Short was held, they might have found physical evidence, fingerprints, fibers, blood, that could have pointed directly to a specific individual. Without that location, investigators were working with the evidence present at the disposal site, which by its nature was far less rich in trace evidence. There is one more dimension of this case that deserves serious attention, and that is the question of what the case reveals about Los Angeles in 1947, about the world that Elizabeth Short was living in, and about why a crime like this might have happened in that particular place and time. Los Angeles in the late 1940s was a city in profound transition. World War II had ended less than 2 years before Elizabeth Short's death. Hundreds of thousands of veterans were returning to civilian life, many of them changed by combat in ways that were not well understood at the time. The concept of what we would today call post-traumatic stress was not a recognized clinical entity in 1947. Returning veterans were expected to simply readjust, to put the war behind them and get on with their lives. The city's population had expanded enormously during the war years, as workers flooded into California's defense industries, and it continued to grow in the post-war boom. Housing was scarce, social networks were fragile, people moved frequently, changed addresses, changed jobs, made and lost connections rapidly. For a young woman like Elizabeth Short, living without a stable home base, relying on the goodwill of acquaintances, and moving through a city full of strangers who were all themselves trying to find their footing, this was a genuinely precarious situation. She was not unique in her precariousness. There were many young women in similar circumstances in post-war Los Angeles. Most of them, of course, were never harmed. But the social conditions of that world, the transience, the looseness of social networks, the relative anonymity of life in a booming city, created conditions in which a predator could operate with a degree of freedom that might not have existed in a smaller, more tightly knit community. It is also worth noting that the LAPD of 1947 was operating under significant institutional constraints. The department had a well-documented history of corruption in this era, and investigations of the period were conducted in a different legal and procedural framework than modern investigations. There were no Miranda warnings. There were no standardized protocols for the preservation of crime scene evidence of the kind that exist today. Forensic science was in its relative infancy. The detectives who worked the Black Dahlia case in 1947 were, by most accounts, genuinely committed to solving it. But they were working with tools and protocols that were simply not adequate to the complexity of what they were facing. And when the investigation lost momentum, as investigations inevitably do when they fail to produce an arrest, the trail grew cold in ways that no subsequent technology or methodology has been able to fully reverse. Now, let's address the question of modern forensic analysis, because it is something that comes up in virtually every discussion of this case. If the Black Dahlia case were investigated today, using 21st century forensic science, would the outcome be different? The honest answer is, possibly, but not certainly. Modern DNA profiling has solved a remarkable number of cold cases, cases where a physical sample collected decades ago, sometimes carelessly and sometimes with great care, has been submitted to modern analysis and produced a match. The Golden State Killer case, solved in 2018 through genealogical DNA analysis, is perhaps the most famous example, but there are hundreds of others. But the Black Dahlia case presents a particular challenge. The primary crime scene was never found. The physical evidence collected from the disposal site in Leimert Park was, by its nature, limited. The body had been cleaned, which itself reduced the available trace evidence. The items received by the Los Angeles Examiner in the package, which might have carried significant trace evidence, were handled by numerous individuals in the newspaper's offices before investigators had access to them. The chain of custody for any surviving physical evidence from the original investigation is uncertain. Over 80 years, evidence can be lost, mislabeled, degraded, or destroyed, sometimes through official decisions to clear storage space, sometimes through accidents, sometimes through bureaucratic failure. Whether any evidence from the Black Dahlia case survives in a form that would support modern forensic analysis is, at this point, an open question. Here's what I want to ask you directly, because this is one of the genuinely interesting puzzles at the heart of this case. Given everything we have discussed, the medical knowledge element, the deliberate staging of the body, the apparent careful planning, the fact that the primary crime scene was never found despite an investigation of extraordinary scope, what kind of person do you think was responsible for Elizabeth Short's death? Not a name, not a specific individual, but what profile does the evidence suggest to you? Tell us in the comments. Because people who engage seriously with this case bring genuinely different perspectives, and after 8 decades, every serious analysis matters. As we move toward the present day, let's look at where the investigation officially stands. The LAPD has, at various points in the decades since 1947, periodically revisited the Black Dahlia case. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department has also at times had involvement in reviewing cold cases from this era. There have been no public announcements of any breakthrough or of any individual being identified as a primary suspect in recent years. The case is classified as an unsolved homicide. It remains one of the oldest open cases in Los Angeles County. It is, by any measure, one of the most famous unsolved murders in the history of the United States. Historians have noted that the Black Dahlia case holds a specific place in American cultural history as one of the first major crimes to capture nationwide attention in the post-war era. In the decades since, it has inspired novels, films, television series, academic studies of the media's relationship to crime, and ongoing public fascination. A 1987 novel by James Ellroy, titled The Black Dahlia, brought a new generation of readers to the story. A 2006 film adaptation brought it to an even wider audience. True crime as a genre, the genre you are engaged with right now by watching this video, owes something of its modern shape to the template established by the press coverage of this case in 1947. But the cultural legacy of the Black Dahlia case comes with a responsibility. A responsibility to remember that at the center of all the dramatizations, all the theories, all the cultural artifact, is a real person. Elizabeth Short was not a noir archetype. She was not a symbol. She was a 22-year-old woman from Massachusetts who had a family, who had friends, who had dreams that we will never know the full shape of, because she did not live long enough to realize them. She had sisters who grieved her. She had a mother who had already weathered so much hardship and who now faced the unimaginable. She was a person, not a case file and not a headline. The dignity of that personhood deserves to be part of any honest reckoning with what happened on that Tuesday morning in Leimert Park, and in the unknown location where Elizabeth Short met her end. Now let us take a step back and look at the full arc of this investigation one more time, because I think it is worth consolidating what we know, what we don't know, and what the evidence actually tells us with confidence. What we know: Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in Boston, Massachusetts. She spent portions of her youth in New England and Florida before traveling to California in the early 1940s. By 1946, she was living in and around Los Angeles. She had no documented employment in the film industry despite later descriptions of her as an aspiring actress. Her body was discovered on the morning of January 15, 1947, in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles by a neighbor named Betty Bersinger. Medical examiners estimated her death had occurred on or around January 14 or 15, 1947. She had been held and killed at an unknown location and transported to the discovery site. The LAPD conducted an investigation that produced over 150 persons of interest. No one was ever charged or convicted. What we don't know: who killed her, where she was during the 5 days between her last confirmed sighting at the Biltmore Hotel and the discovery of her body, the location of the primary crime scene, the specific sequence of events that led to her death, whether the package received by the Los Angeles Examiner was genuinely connected to the killer, whether the crime was committed by a single individual or more than one, whether the perpetrator was ever investigated as one of the over 150 persons of interest, or whether he or she or they entirely escaped the attention of investigators. What the evidence tells us with confidence: that whoever was responsible for Elizabeth Short's death was methodical, careful, and possessed knowledge and capabilities beyond those of an impulsive or disorganized offender. That the crime was planned in advance, at least to some degree. That the killer took steps to conceal evidence and to control the narrative of the discovery. And that despite all of this, and despite one of the most intensive murder investigations in the history of the Los Angeles Police Department, this person was never brought to justice. That last fact, that justice was never delivered, is the most painful part of this story. Not the mystery itself, as compelling as it is. Not the cultural legacy, as significant as it has been. But the simple, unvarnished fact that Elizabeth Short's family never received an answer. That her mother and her sisters lived their lives not knowing what had happened, or why, or who. That is what an unsolved murder actually means. Not a compelling puzzle for the rest of us to analyze, but a wound that never healed, in the lives of the people who loved Elizabeth Short and waited, in vain, for justice. The Black Dahlia case will almost certainly never be officially solved. The individuals who could definitively answer the central questions of this investigation are, in all likelihood, no longer alive. The physical evidence that might support a modern prosecution may not exist in any usable form. The LAPD's investigation remains technically open, but there is no active lead that appears to be moving toward resolution. What remains is the record, the historical account of a crime that shocked a city and a nation, that exposed the vulnerabilities of a system of investigation that was simply not equipped for what it was facing, and that has never let go of the public imagination in nearly 80 years. And what remains, most importantly, is the memory of Elizabeth Short. A young woman from Boston, 22 years old, who deserved a life that was never allowed to unfold. Before we close, I want to offer one final thought about what the Black Dahlia case means for how we think about true crime and cold cases more broadly. There is a tendency, when we engage with cases like this one, to focus on the mystery, the puzzle quality of it, the whodunit. That is natural. The human mind is drawn to puzzles, particularly puzzles that seem in principle to be solvable even when in practice they have resisted solution for decades. The Black Dahlia case is one of those puzzles. Every generation brings new eyes to it, new tools, new frameworks for interpretation, and the hope that this time, this set of eyes, this new approach, will be the one that finally cracks it. But the case also asks us to confront something more uncomfortable than a puzzle. It asks us to sit with genuine, irreducible uncertainty. To acknowledge that sometimes, the systems we rely on to deliver justice, the police, the courts, the forensic science, the investigative apparatus of the state, simply do not succeed. Not because of a failure of effort or a lack of resources, but because the crime was committed in a way that did not leave the kind of evidence that justice requires. The Black Dahlia case is, among other things, a monument to that particular form of failure. Not a failure of investigation, but a failure of justice. And those are not the same thing. Elizabeth Short was murdered in January 1947. She was 22 years old. Her case remains unsolved. Her killer, or killers, were never identified. And she deserves to be remembered not as the Black Dahlia, not as a lurid headline from a newspaper that is now 78 years in the past, but as Elizabeth Short. A daughter, a sister, a young woman with a life that mattered. If any new evidence in this case ever becomes part of the public record, if the LAPD ever makes a significant announcement, if a credible forensic development emerges, we will cover it. Because this case deserves that level of attention, and because Elizabeth Short deserves that level of attention. Now here is what I want to know from you. After everything we have discussed today, the staging of the crime, the medical knowledge element, the 5 missing days, the 150 persons of interest who were all ultimately cleared or released, what do you think happened? What theory makes the most sense to you based on the evidence in the public record? Do you think the killer was someone in Elizabeth Short's immediate social world? Someone she had just met? Someone who had been planning this for a long time? Or do you think the truth of this case is something that none of us has yet considered seriously enough? Drop your theory in the comments. We want to know what you think. We go through every comment on every video, and the thinking our viewers bring to these cases genuinely shapes how we approach them. If you think you know what happened to Elizabeth Short, drop your theory in the comments. And if you enjoyed this case, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true crime mysteries, new cases all the time. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.